This lecture is about active student responding, also known as ASR. And active student responding is just how it sounds. It is an active response from the students. So students aren't passively listening, possibly raising their hand. Instead, all students are making active, detectable responses during instruction. There are guide notes available for this lecture, and you are welcome to use those. So why do we want to increase active student responding in a classroom? Because we know that there is a correlation between student engagement and their achievement. So students tend to achieve more when they're engaged more. ASR gives teachers very important feedback on how well the students are doing within the lesson. So if during your lesson you are requesting that students make responses routinely, that way you are able to gauge, do they get it, do they not get it? That way you're not waiting till the end of the lesson to find out that maybe they didn't get it, and then you wasted that entire class period. Additionally, ASR is correlated with more on-task behavior. So if students are being asked to make detectable responses in your instruction, then they are more likely to be on task so that they're well prepared when you do ask those questions. So for the first reason, the correlation between ASR and achievement, research was done a very, very long time ago, the Rosenshine and First wanted to determine what are the variables that tell us that students will be successful. So looking at multiple classrooms, where were students the most successful? What were the daily practices of that teacher? And so these are all of the 10 variables that they found to make sure students were high achievers. So yes, you want to do all 10 of these things. However, when beginning teaching, we tend to just want to focus on a couple things that we want to do to improve our practices. So what we know for sure is that these two variables determine a student's success. So the first is rather obvious. So the more content you're able to cover in your class, the more likely students will be successful. And that just makes sense because if you're not teaching them something, they're not able then to get it right or to learn it. So the more we can cover, the better. And then second, academically engaged minutes. So this is not students sitting and passively listening to a teacher lecture. It's not students doing silent sustained reading. It's time when they're truly engaged, making responses. And from those two variables, what we do know is that when all other variables are equal, so when classrooms are exactly the same in every possible way, if one has more active student responding, then students will achieve more in that classroom. So all this to say that when active student responding is used in your classroom, students are very, very, very likely to be successful. The second reason that ASR gives the teacher important feedback just lets the teacher always know where the students are and also how they're doing as a teacher. So it gives them that immediate information to let them know. All right, and the final, the ASR is correlated with on-task behavior. So what we know is that when students are more on task, they're less likely to be off task and disruptive, right? So if you're making sure that students are engaged and you have the expectation in your classroom that students will make detectable responses throughout a lecture, there's just a lot less time to be distracted. And students will tend to refocus if they do get distracted because they know that question's going to be coming soon that they're expected to be able to answer. Right. So when student is more on task, they're more likely to hear your instructions, they're more likely to interact with the curriculum, and they're more likely to receive that feedback that you're giving them during a lesson. When students are paying attention and on task, the other peers in the class are able to do the same. So, the students who are off task will often disrupt others, even the students who are highly successful. They can just get off task and be distracted, and they can also miss important things. So if we're able to use a practice like ASR that will keep students more engaged and more on task, then there's less likely to be distractions to all students. And lastly, on-task students make teachers feel good, right? So if they are engaged with you, engaged with the material, you just kind of feel better as a teacher. You feel better about who you are and what you're doing each day. And I will say, even as a professor, when I look out into my class, even if it's just a 50-minute class, if I have one or two students who are checking their phone more than usual, or who are chatting with someone else, or who just are not involved in the lesson that day, I, after class, immediately feel like a failure. It'll bug me the whole rest of the day, sometimes into the next day. That's just if one or two students aren't engaged. So I can say if I have a class where all of the students are involved with the material, involved with me, it just makes me feel more successful. And that's selfish, for sure. But it's okay as teachers to say, I want my students to be on task. It makes me feel like I'm being successful with them. Because as teachers, that's what we want. We want to be successful. We want our students to learn. That's what our success is. Right, so what is an active student response? I feel like so far we've kind of made a case for why we should be using active student responding, but what exactly is it? And you've heard me say these things already, but ASR is each time a student makes a detectable response to your instruction or to one of your questions or to any prompts you provide. And in order for something to be detectable, it can either be heard or seen, right? So you have to be able to hear students responding, or physically see them responding. It's not a situation where you ask a question and two students raise their hand to answer the question, right? So that's detectable in that two of the students may be able to produce the correct answer, but the whole rest of your class is not. So they are not producing detectable responses, right? So you want to do as much as you can to make sure every single student in your classroom is making as many detectable responses as possible during each of your lessons. There is an important distinction between on-task and ASR. We want students to be on task, right? So we want them to be making eye contact. We want them to have their books open to the right page. We want them to be quiet and have their hands where they're supposed to have them, have their feet where they're supposed to have them, be sitting in their chair, all of those things. But all of those things are not necessarily active student responding. So you can be on task but not actually be attending to what you're supposed to be attending to, right? So clearly I go to many meetings, and there are many meetings where I'm making eye contact with the people that are speaking, where I'm looking down at the agenda when I'm supposed to. Sometimes people will laugh, and even if I'm not paying attention at all, I can still have my eyes where they're supposed to be. I can still have my notes out. I can still laugh when I hear other people laugh at the appropriate time. But there's no guarantee that I'm actually paying attention, right? So I'm not making any active responses that tells the speaker or the other people at my meeting that I'm truly engaged, right? So on task are just a set of behaviors that possibly could mean that I'm engaged, but it could also mean I'm not, right? I think we've all been there where we can make it look like we're paying attention, but we're not. So what we have to do as teachers, yes, we want our students to be on task, but we have to be able to take that further and make sure that they are engaged and not just passively on task. All right, so if we look at a student who's not talking out during silent reading, so you say, okay, everyone take out your book and read, and this particular student is not talking out, that's on task. That's not making a detectable response. And silent sustained reading is always, it's a great exercise, but you also have to be very careful, especially with struggling students. It's very easy to look at a book and gauge how often the other students are turning the page, and then you turn the page every, 25 seconds, and keep looking at the page so it looks like you're reading, right? And so to a teacher, you look out, this person's being quiet. Is that active student responding, or is that just being on task? Right? Silent sustained reading, you're not necessarily seeing or hearing. Therefore, this is only on task. It's not an active student response. Right. So finishing math problems, is this on task or ASR? So to be more specific, finishing math problems correctly. So this is ASR because it's something that we can see. right? So we're assuming there's a worksheet here. So you'll be able to see if the student was making active student responses by looking at their math worksheet to see if they finished the math problems. Eye contact during instruction. This is an example I gave just a couple minutes ago. This is definitely on task. Do we want students to do this? Absolutely. But making eye contact does not guarantee that students are engaged in any way. Stating an answer aloud. So can you see this or can you hear it? Yes, you can hear a student stating an answer out loud. Therefore, this is active student responding. Right. And this is just another graphic, I think, that does a really nice job of just illustrating a typical school day and how little time students spend making active responses. So the big black, the outside black line, represents available time during a typical school day. So things like transportation is involved here, arriving, maybe getting breakfast, arriving to your classroom, also things like lining up for the bus, and everything else that happens during the day. That's that outside circle. So that's your whole available time with students, right? So then the next line in is the allocated time. And this is time that's allocated to the classroom. So outside of the classroom, there are lots of transitions to get to the classroom, to get to other places they need to be during the day and getting home and things like that. So the allocated time takes into account when the teacher begins the day with the student and ends the day with the student. Right. So within that then is the instructional time. Because that allocated time is when teachers have them, but so much time is spent in transitions or things like taking attendance, restroom breaks, all of those day-to-day activities. And then we have actual instructional time. And during that instructional time, there are also lots of transitions, a lot of time where teachers are actually lecturing, are in front of the students doing most of the work for them. And then time on task, and that's time that students spend doing those on-task behaviors, such as eye contact with the teacher while they're talking, or looking at their textbooks, engaged with possibly a science experiment, all of that. And then the yellow represents of the entire school day how much time students typically spend making active responses. And the reason why this is important is because we know that the more ASR, the more successful students will be. So as teachers, your goal will be to take that yellow and expand it, right? So you want that yellow to be as close to the purple as possible so that throughout your instructional time, students are constantly making active, detectable responses. But how do you do that, right? So I'm going to talk about three main ways you can increase ASR during your big group instruction or small group instruction. The first is choral responding, the second is response cards, the third are guided notes or structured worksheets. The first is choral responding, and choral responding is just as the word sounds. It's chorally responding as a group. So all students in the group respond at the exact same time to each question. Corresponding is appropriate for basically any subject area, any age. I use corresponding, well, I had to engage in corresponding in my doctoral program in our classes. That was often something that the professor would do. They would ask a question and we would all chorally respond together as a group. And then clearly I've seen it done even in preschool with my own children. I've observed in their classroom and I've seen corresponding being used there too. So it's all ages. The important aspects of corresponding is that there's only one correct answer. So if you're posing a question to students, what is the capital of Ohio? And everyone says Columbus, that's pretty easy to determine if everyone gets it, if a few students miss it or not, because there's one correct answer. But if you're saying, name one of the Great Lakes, and everyone chorally responds a different one, it's very difficult to tell if anyone got it wrong, or basically if anyone got it right. The answer should be relatively short. And it should be suitable for fast-paced instruction. So if a lesson you shouldn't pause and spend an awful lot of time asking a choral response question. It's meant to be quick. It's a quick check-in to see if students are attending, to see if students understood the content that you've presented thus far, or if you need to go back and cover something again. With choral responding, you want to provide clear instructions. So you have to train students how to do this. So you have to tell them the type of responses that you're looking for. You have to model this for them. And this is just an example. And it may be possible or it may be necessary that you provide a thinking pause. So if you're asking a question that you want students to know pretty automatically because you've already covered it multiple times, then you don't need a thinking pause. But if it's something that's new within your content that you've just taught, it's okay to give them a second or two to gather their thoughts and really truly understand the question that you're asking. So a thinking pause is always acceptable if you think it's okay. You want to make sure with corresponding that you have a clear signal so that students are all responding at the same time. If you have students who are responding a little too soon or a little too late, then that's your missed opportunity to really understand who got it and who didn't, because it's all going to kind of be jumbled together. The most common question I hear is with corresponding, if you haven't done this before as a teacher, then you tend to think that you might not hear students getting it wrong. But I can promise you, when everyone's responding at the same time, if someone misses it, you definitely can pinpoint immediately where it came from. And then the question then becomes, how am I giving feedback? If everyone's answering at the same time, I don't want to point out one or two students and say, you got it wrong and this is why. So you have to always make sure you're giving some sort of group majority feedback. So if you hear mostly or all correct answers, then make sure you just confirm it. Yes, that's correct. And then keep going. If you tend to hear maybe one or two people aren't getting it right, then just say, yes, that's correct, and then restate the correct answer. Right? And it's okay then to come back to that question a little bit later and make sure that hopefully everyone gets it right then. If you hear a lot of confusion, and you will hear this for sure, or if there's a pause, or if you give your signal and there's some hesitance to answer, then that tells you that you didn't cover that effectively as a teacher. And so you can make that decision to just tell them what the answer is and then explain it. But you're going to have to make sure you're covering that same question again. But it may be that you've determined that you didn't cover it extensively enough and you have to go back and spend some time teaching that lesson in a different way too. So with corresponding, it's okay to mix things up. So if you're using corresponding, cool, but it's okay then to call on individual students at the same time, right? One of the things you also want to make sure you do is you're asking the question first, right? So if you're asking the question and before calling on a student or giving the signal, then all students have to have an answer in their head and be prepared to answer the question. So if I say to, let's see, I don't think anyone, let's say Kendall. Let's say that we're all sitting in a class together and there's a student named Kendall in there. So if I look to Kendall and I say, okay, Kendall, I'm going to ask you this next question. What do all of you do? You probably all turn off, right? You're like, oh, I don't have to answer that question. I'm not going to truly focus on it. Whereas if I pose the question first and everyone has the understanding that I could call on you at any time, or I'm going to ask you to respond using choral responding, then you're already starting to prepare the answer in your head. Right? And that's what you want. You want students to always be preparing an answer and be ready to give the answer. One of the cool things too that you can do is with choral responding, if you know a student struggling, so you ask the choral response question, you keep an eye on the student who might struggle a little bit. If they get it right, then call on them, go back to them and say, hey Ashley, what was that answer again? And let them say the answer. You knew they got it right, so calling on them, you know they're going to get it right, and that just builds the confidence too. So there's a lot of really cool aspects of corresponding. You want to always make sure you have a lively pace. If there's too much slowdown, students will get distracted. So corresponding, there always needs to be a lively pace. But to keep that lively pace, you have to be prepared, right? You can't come up with these questions in the moment. You should have questions prepared ahead of time that you're going to ask students for corresponding. And as students are responding, you want to praise correct answers, but you also want to praise students for following the correct protocol. So if you have students who are always waiting on the signal, then make sure you say, okay, thank you for waiting for my signal, right? That's what you want to do. Or if you have students, you will probably have students who yell the answer and probably some students who will whisper the answer, right? So instead of telling someone to stop yelling or telling the other person they need to be louder, find the student who's using the correct volume and say thank you for not yelling, thank you for using just the right volume. Or maybe you have a volume system in your class where like 3 is an outside voice, 1 is a whisper, and 2 is academic responding, and you say, okay, thank you so and so for using a 2. All right, number one was corresponding, and the second are response cards. And response cards, they're cards, but they don't have to be what you think of with a card, right? So this is just an alternative to having students raise their hands. So they have these cards where all of the students are responding at the same time. They're either writing responses or holding up a correct answer. Right, so there are 2 main kinds. One's called the pre-printed response card, and one's the write-on. So pre-printed means they have all of the answers are already on these cards in some way. Whereas the write-on, students are going to be writing their response. And I'm going to show you a couple examples. The first 2 examples are the pre-printed response cards.
Ready, guys? You ready? Yeah. Okay. Today our class is going to show the whole class response joyful learning strategy. Today we're going to do it with medial sounds in words, and we are learning the sound. What sound are we learning? It. Is everybody ready? Okay. And today we have 2 different cards. Can everyone hold up their blue card? This card is our yes card. We're going to say if the word has an it sound in the middle of it, we're going to hold up what color? Yes. Blue or yes. And if it does not have an it sound in the middle, what color card are we going to hold up?
Red, no.
Red, and that means?
No.
No. Okay, here we go. Is everybody ready? Our first word is hat. Does hat have an it sound in it? No, let's see your note cards.
This isn't unless it was hit.
Let's listen for the second word. Okay, cards out. Cards out. Our next word is sit. Everyone should be holding up the yes card or the blue cards. It. All right, excellent job. Cards down. Cards down. Yeah, cards down. Okay, next word is bat. But at. Everyone should be holding up the no. Okay.
All right, so that's one example of response cards.
Hi, my name is Amy Ayers, and I'm currently a 4th grade math teacher in Lubbock Independent School District. In the past, I've taught 6th grade science. In both settings, the strategies I'm showing today are useful in all settings, but particularly in math and science. One of the things I use in my classroom on a fairly regular basis is response cards. This is an example of the response card my students use. I made these because it's very affordable to make them yourself, but you can also purchase them if you like them to be neat and nice. Mine, I utilize 4 different colors so that I can use them just to kind of gauge where students are. They can show me, they can pinch the green if they're feeling very confident about the material, yellow if they're a little bit uncomfortable with it, red if they totally don't understand what I'm talking about, and blue means that they get it, bonus, I can teach you. I also use it for multiple choice assessments. So I just do a couple questions in class. I wouldn't utilize it if I was doing 20 plus questions. I'd do something different. But for just a few checkpoint questions before we move on to something else, I'll have them grab this out of their caddy at their table. Each student has one of their own. They hold it in front of them, and they look at the question, and then I say 3, 2, 1, reveal, and they will pinch whatever they select. I encourage them to hold it in front of their chest so that it's not something that everybody around them is looking for, and it's more just a response between me and them. Another feature of this card is on the back. You can also use it for yes/no responses and true/false responses. So this makes it a little more versatile and allows you to use different types of questions with your students. I use this pretty much every day in my classroom, and the kids work well with it. It works well with them, and I hope you find it useful as well.
All right, so you can see those are pre-printed. That means that the students will all have those at their desk and the answers are already on there. So clearly, an issue with that is that you're limited in that you're essentially asking students multiple choice questions, or yes, no, or true, false. Those are all helpful, very helpful. It'd be nice if students could write their own response so you could see where they're at. And so the other option then would be to have write-on response cards.
This is a place where an animal lives. A place where an animal lives. Gets all its needs. Oops. Show me, please. Wow. What's the answer to this one, please? Cat. Please erase. Let's try again. No, I can't use that one. Board right behind me. Water as a gas. Show me, please. I thought I tricked you and there was no way I could. Water vapor. Very well done. Let's try another. Make food.
All right, so those write-on response cards were whiteboards. And there are definitely high-tech strategies or higher-tech things that you can use for response cards. I don't know if you guys have heard of Plickers, but Plickers is an option. And then there are a lot of apps that have whiteboard type apps. Also, the clickers. I don't know if you've ever used those in any of your classes. Right, so those are all more high-tech ways of getting at response cards, but there's no need. There's really no need for those. I'm a huge fan of the whiteboards. I use them in my classes at Ohio Dominican. I use them in my doctoral classes as a student. I just think they're very, very powerful tools. And they're also very cheap. They're very durable. One of the suggestions I always give to my students as they're leaving, when you're going into your own classroom, go to Home Depot. They make big pieces like for a wall that's whiteboard material. Get a huge piece and ask them to cut it into like 5x5, 6x6, however big you want your whiteboards. And therefore you will have a huge stack of whiteboards for your students. I just would always use those. It's just a very easy way to check and see where students are. I use them sometimes in my classes, even when students are doing group work. And I say, okay, on your whiteboards, write these things down so I can gauge how engaged you are with the material. And so also so you can hold it up and let other groups see what you guys came up with. So I just think whiteboards are a wonderful tool. Even though they may be a little old school, I still think they're extremely relevant. So suggestions for using response cards is similar to corresponding in that you still need to teach students how to use them. There are lots of things you need to teach depending on the age. So even things like how to responsibly use a marker, how to responsibly write on your whiteboard. You shouldn't be making pictures, like all of that. All of these things need to be taught with rules and modeled for the students. Again, keep up a lively pace. If you spend too much time in between your questions, students will be drawing. Students will be writing with their markers on their friend's arm, whatever it may be. So keep that lively pace. And again, make sure you have a clear signal for when students should be responding. Right? You don't want students to put up their whiteboards when they're done, and other students may still be thinking. They could look over, see another response, and then copy it down. So then you're not getting a true gauge of where students are. Again, give feedback based upon the majority. So if most of the students get it right, that's where you want your focus to be. If there is a particularly difficult question that a lot of students miss, make sure you cover that again soon too. And if a student doesn't know the answer, still have them hold up their whiteboard, but they're allowed to look at others too, right? So once they have their cards up, it's perfectly fine to take a look at others to see what other people said. This is an example of a pre-printed response card that I've seen. This isn't, obviously, this is taken off of Google Images, but I've seen something just like this used in the classroom. Students make their own clock, and a teacher might say, okay, on your clock, show me 1:30. Show me 2:15. Right, and they're holding them up at the same time as everyone else. The teacher is able to see who gets it and who doesn't. I also saw this. These are moon phases. So students make the moon phases. And then you can ask different questions about what phase are we in currently, or what phase follows the waning gibbous phase. These are just some other examples of cards that you can make that I thought were pretty cool. These are basic ones, but I like the top left and the top right. I think it just gives students a little more autonomy in their responses, and it's not necessarily multiple choice. So you want to make sure your pre-printed response cards are durable. I would, depending on what age you're going to be teaching, if I had an elementary classroom, I would make a set for basically every unit that I would be teaching, and then laminate them and have like 25 copies, and then have them in a bin, and then every unit I get out the next bin with the next cards, and then keep those year to year. So make sure they're durable. Lamination is always recommended for students. Make sure they're easy for students to manipulate. You don't want to have this huge response card, or you don't want to have a stack of 20, right? You want to make sure students are able to quickly access 3, 4, possibly 5 options for answers. Another thing too you want to try to do is make sure the answers are on both sides. So sometimes if a student holds up a card and they're showing you their response on the front, they don't really remember what they had on the back. So if you have it on the back, they're able to then just get that extra reminder of what the correct response is. All right, I already said the durable part, but make sure you start with a small set of cards, and then you can add more as the student's skills improve. So when you're first doing this, you don't want to give them 10 options, right? And you want to make sure you're only giving a couple at a time. Make sure you're limiting the length of your responses. So if students are going to be writing on the whiteboard, you don't want to have them write a paragraph, because you have to actually read them. They're going to put them up, and then you have to read very quickly to find out, did everyone get it? Did a couple people miss it? What did they have, right? So you have to immediately give feedback. So make sure you're not asking for these really long responses. Make sure students aren't worried about what they're writing on their board. Spelling is always an issue, and you never want to minimize the importance of spelling, but you may want to establish that when using whiteboards, there are different rules. So you can always say, spelling is not an issue on the whiteboard. That's the don't worry procedure. Like, don't worry about spelling, give it your best shot. You can also have the words, there was a word bank in the video you saw with the whiteboard, but you didn't catch that, I'm sure, because I don't think it was very clear. But she kept referring back to the word wall behind her. So the words were all posted there, therefore the students were expected to spell them correctly because they were all there for them. You could also pre-practice how to spell each of the words before you ask the questions. You will always find, no matter what age, the students like to draw on their whiteboards. This is true in my college classes. Most of my students I'll find them doodling on them within their free time. All right, so with the younger ones, you can use that as a reinforcer. Give them a couple minutes before you start while you're getting your stuff ready. Tell them they can write on it. Or you can let them know if everyone is responding as they should be on the signal and with the right pace, that you'll give them 2 minutes at the end to write. So use that whiteboard as a reinforcer for sure. And make sure you have lots of extra markers. One of the things that I've always found helpful is for each student I would have a sock. Like obviously not a used dirty sock or anything, but some socks. And in the sock I would put 1 or 2 markers, and then when the students are using their whiteboards, they take the marker out and then they put the sock on their weak hand, and that becomes their eraser. Right? So you're writing the answer with the marker, holding up your board, and then you have that sock on your other hand and you're able to erase it. So that sock will hold the marker, but it will also erase so that students aren't getting that marker all over their hands or their clothes. All right, then we have guided notes. I won't spend a lot of time on guided notes, but guided notes are active student responses. Right? Students are expected to fill in the blanks. Doesn't guarantee that they're taking in all of the information. It guarantees that they're making a detectable response that you can see. Right? That's what's important. Right, so we know that lecture is widely used. It's used in K-12 classrooms. It's used in your college classrooms. It's used everywhere. So I personally am a big guided notes fan. I know there are probably some people that are not. But what I like about guided notes is that my students' eyes and ears are able to be on me and what I'm saying and not caught up in writing notes. I also like that it takes the pressure off students and that you don't have to figure out what it is I want you to know and write everything down. So that's what a lot of students will do. They'll say, I don't know what's important. I'm going to write everything. And then you're missing out on a lot of the explanation or some of the things that might help you to really understand the information because you're so caught up in writing down word for word what your professor is saying. So I love that it gives you all, you have to write, so you're making responses, and it gives you this set of notes that tells you, like, this is what I think is important and what I really want you to focus on. Right? I think it's the fair thing to do for students. We do know that successful students take notes, right? So you will rarely, if ever, see a student who is a high achiever who doesn't take notes, right? That's amazing if they don't do that. So using guided notes will help students to be successful, which is what the ultimate goal is as a teacher. Right. A lot of your students won't know how to take good notes, so this gives them a format or a model for how to take notes. And eventually what you can do is, as a teacher, you can have, when you're doing guided notes, have a few blanks at first, and maybe throughout the school year, you start to give more blanks and more blanks and more blanks so that it teaches students how to take notes. I also like guided notes in that it keeps me on track. So I know in my classes, if I miss a blank, I have 10 hands up in the air, or there's whispering, right? And that tells me I missed something. So it's a great way to keep teachers on track too. Right. When creating your guided notes, make sure that the guided notes includes everything you want students to know. Right. That's just fair. So don't give them guided notes over some of the information and expect them to find the rest. It's important they have this condensed version of everything they need to know. I mentioned this already, but consider fading the use of the guided notes. And then make sure you're building in follow-up activities. So if you're expecting students to take or to use guided notes, build in some positive reinforcement for that, right? Tell students if they can produce a complete weekly set of guided notes, they can get extra points. Or you can say, okay, on Friday, I'm going to randomly select 2 students and 1 day of notes. And if they have those done, then the whole class can receive 5 extra points on this week's quiz, right? So something like that. Build in reinforcement that will encourage students to use the notes because they may not see the value in them, but you know that in order for them to be successful, they should be taking notes. All right, structured worksheets are, they're very similar to guided notes, but it's much more of a focus on skills and not just knowledge. So with guided notes, you're giving students information and they're writing down this important information. But with structured worksheets, you're presenting them with a skill, modeling it for them, and then they're practicing it. So I see this used very often in math classes, but it's not just math, but it definitely lends itself well to math classes. All right, this is an example of a structured worksheet. So it starts out with some basic information about why it's important to take notes. First tip says use abbreviation and symbols, and this would be where they would just be following along with you. So this means at. Write that symbol here. So this is where you're giving them the information, and then they start to practice. So you're providing information, but then they're also supposed to be learning a skill and therefore then practicing the skill. Right, so then they start to practice. Let's practice using abbreviations, and then the students are expected to use this information to write shortened notes. Right, so this is the difference between guided notes. Guided notes is just filling things in, and there really isn't a lot for students to produce per se, just writing down information. Whereas a structured worksheet is doing that. It is learning a new skill, and it has that built-in practice there. Right. So some of the best structured worksheets follow Model Lead Test. Model Lead Test should be familiar with you from this class. So make sure you review what Model Lead Test is. But structured worksheets are best when they follow Model Lead Test. So the first part of it is teacher modeling what the expectation is, and then having students slowly produce their responses on this worksheet, and then test, meaning independent work by the student. The student will then independently um, perform this skill with some feedback. All right, so ASR, one of the things I want to point out is you will often hear about formative assessment. You'll hear about it in your classes, you will hear about it in your placements, you will hear about it once you're a teacher. It's just, it's the big thing right now is formative assessment. And formative assessment is assessment done during the lesson while students are still learning that allows you to make immediate instructional changes. And that is corresponding, that is response cards, that is guided notes, that is structured worksheets. Those are all assessments to see where students are. And it allows you, because you're using it during your instruction quickly and easily, you're able to change your instruction if you need to. If you try corresponding and maybe you ask 3 questions and everyone gets it right quickly, and that tells you maybe you can speed things up a little bit, cover a little more content, make things a little more interesting, dive into subjects a little bit deeper. If you have students who are frequently missing things on your corresponding or on those whiteboards, then change your instruction. Go back and model some more, cover things a little bit deeper so that they understand it. Right? That's the beauty of formative assessment. That's the beauty of active student responding, is it allows you to immediately know where students are and make immediate changes so that they're able to learn instead of wasting time where you don't know who's getting it and who isn't. Right? You should always know where your students are and make sure your instruction is where it needs to be to make sure everyone is learning. ASR is quick, it's easy, it's cheap, right? So corresponding by far is the cheapest, right? It's just you asking a question and students using their voices to respond, right? Pre-printed response cards maybe could get a little expensive. However, if you're making a high quality set, they'll last you years and years, especially if you're able to laminate those. Right, so there's no reason to not use those strategies. They're quick, easy, and very cheap. Students become more engaged, right? So I can see the difference in my classes because I have whiteboards in my classes. When students know that I'm going to be calling on them or asking them to respond, they're just more alert. They're asking better questions because they don't know when a question is coming that they're going to have to know, right? Whereas the classrooms that I have seen where you go in and all that happens is the teacher stands up front and talks for 50 minutes, right? As a student, you know you're not going to be asked to do anything. So you can choose that day to actually sit and listen and be engaged or not. There's nothing that forces you to be engaged. And not that you want to force students to be engaged per se, but your job is to motivate students the best that you can to pay attention, to learn, right? And sometimes we need things that are holding us accountable to be motivated. Even as an adult, I'm that way, absolutely that way. And then lots of feedback. Students want to know where they're at. They want to know, do I get it? Do I not get it? And asking these questions throughout your lesson, it lets students know where they're at. If I ask a whiteboard question in my classes and a few students don't know, they may have thought they totally got it, but then when they were asked to produce an answer, they didn't, so that way they know. Right? Too many times I see students floating through the semester thinking they're at one place with a class, finding out from a midterm that they really didn't know what they think they know. And by midterm, it's a little too late. Right? So always let students know where they're at by asking these questions, but also always know where they're at for your sake too, so you know that you can make corrections to help them.